Matt Moneymaker built his entire life around one question. Not a career, not a television franchise, his life. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, decades of independent fieldwork, 11 seasons of Finding Bigfoot, all of it organized around a single pursuit, whose answer he has been closer to than almost anyone alive. 1 minute ago, he confirmed that Finding Bigfoot found that answer, and that Animal Planet buried the evidence before the audience could see it. Subscribe and stay until the very end. Matt Moneymaker's relationship to the Bigfoot question is unlike any other figure in the paranormal documentary landscape in a way that the Finding Bigfoot television format consistently undersold, and that the audience who followed the show across its 11 seasons only partially registered through the production's entertainment framework. He did not arrive at the Bigfoot question through curiosity or through a single encounter that redirected his attention from other pursuits. He arrived at it through a process of sustained, systematic engagement that began in his early adult life and that has never been interrupted by the commercial and institutional pressures that deflect most researchers from the subjects whose evidence most demands their sustained attention. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, the BFRO, that Moneymaker founded and has led across its development into the most comprehensive organization of its kind in the world, represents the full investment of his professional and intellectual energy in a single research question whose answer his accumulated evidence has been consistently pointing toward without the institutional framework to receive that answer fully. The BFRO database contains the most extensive systematic collection of Bigfoot encounter reports ever assembled, tens of thousands of accounts from independent witnesses across the full geographic range of North America, documented under the organizational protocols that Moneymaker developed to distinguish reports of genuine evidential value from the range of misidentification, fabrication, and cultural amplification that the broader Bigfoot report landscape contains. That database represents decades of fieldwork by researchers whose training Moneymaker organized and whose evidence assessment methodology he developed. It is the most substantive research infrastructure the Bigfoot question has ever had. What it has been pointing toward across its accumulation is what Moneymaker's confirmation now establishes the Finding Bigfoot investigation reached. The show was not the destination of his research career. It was the documentation of the approach to a destination that the BFRO's accumulated evidence had been charting across decades of systematic fieldwork. What he just confirmed is that the destination was reached during the show's investigation record, and that the documentation of the arrival was buried by the network before the audience could be shown where the approach had led. The Finding Bigfoot production that Animal Planet commissioned and broadcast across 11 seasons was understood differently by the two parties whose relationship produced it: the network that acquired it as a cable entertainment property and the investigation team whose methodology and whose evidence base the production was designed to document. Animal Planet understood Finding Bigfoot as a paranormal reality series whose commercial proposition was the sustained, dramatic tension of a search that produced compelling evidence without definitive resolution. The format whose audience retention depended on the question remaining open across seasons rather than being answered in a way that concluded the show's central premise. The investigation team, Moneymaker, Cliff Barackman, Ranae Holland, and Bobo Fay, understood Finding Bigfoot as an investigation platform whose commercial infrastructure gave them access to field locations, research resources, and audience reach that the BFRO's independent operation could not match. The show was, from the team's perspective, a vehicle for conducting the most extensive and the most systematically documented Bigfoot field investigation in the history of the research, an investigation whose findings would be presented to the audience through the broadcast format while the complete investigation record accumulated in the production archive. The tension between those two understandings, the network's need for sustained unresolved drama and the investigation team's commitment to following the evidence wherever it led, was present in the production from its earliest seasons and managed through the editorial process that shaped each season's broadcast content. The management was sustainable as long as the investigation's most significant findings remained in the category of compelling but ambiguous evidence that the broadcast format could present as the ongoing approach to a definitive answer rather than as the answer itself. What Moneymaker's confirmation establishes is the specific point at which that management became unsustainable, the investigation that produced findings whose character placed them in the category of answer rather than approach, and whose documentation the editorial process could not shape into the ongoing search format without misrepresenting what the investigation had found. Animal Planet's response to that unsustainability was the buried evidence that Moneymaker just confirmed exists. The investigation team's response to it, across the years between the burial and the confirmation, was the sustained silence that Moneymaker's public statement has now broken. The investigation whose evidence Moneymaker's confirmation establishes was buried is not a single episode from a specific season that the Finding Bigfoot audience can identify through the broadcast record. It is an investigation whose broadcast version, if a broadcast version was ever assembled, either does not exist in the public record or exists in a form whose relationship to the complete investigation footage is comparable to the relationship between the Ghost Adventures controversial episode's broadcast version and its complete investigation record. What Moneymaker's confirmation provides about the specific investigation is the account of what the investigation produced rather than an identification of when in the show's 11-season run it occurred, an account whose specificity reflects his direct knowledge of what the investigation documented and whose restraint in providing production timeline details reflects his awareness of the legal and relational context within which his confirmation is being made. The investigation targeted a location in the Pacific Northwest, the geographic region whose evidence density within the BFRO database has been consistently higher than any comparable area of North America, and whose specific characteristics, the old-growth forest canopy, the watershed systems, the elevation range, and the remoteness from population centers, produce the environmental conditions that the accumulated field research most consistently associates with high-probability encounter zones. The location had been on the BFRO's priority investigation list for a period preceding the Finding Bigfoot production, whose specific duration Moneymaker's account does not precisely characterize, but whose implication is that the location's evidence profile had been building in the BFRO database long enough to establish it as a sustained activity zone, rather than a temporary concentration of reports. What made it the investigation that produced the evidence Moneymaker confirms was buried was not the location's prior evidence profile. The BFRO database contains comparable evidence profiles for other locations that the Finding Bigfoot investigation visited without producing the findings the buried investigation document. It was the combination of the location's evidence profile and the specific conditions, environmental, operational, and circumstantial, that the investigation encountered when it deployed there. The conditions aligned in a way that the prior fieldwork experience of every member of the team identified as exceptional, and what the exceptional conditions produced is what Moneymaker's confirmation addresses directly for the first time. The Finding Bigfoot investigation deployment at the location produced evidence across its initial phases that Moneymaker characterizes in his confirmation as the most concentrated body of physical and acoustic documentation the show had compiled at any single location across its 11 seasons. Evidence that established the location's active character with a specificity and a density that exceeded the prior season's most evidentially significant investigation sites before the most significant finding of the deployment had occurred. The track evidence documented during the investigation's baseline phase was the first element of the concentrated evidence profile whose significance Moneymaker's confirmation addresses specifically. The trackways found at the creek drainage and the forest floor transition zones within the investigation area showed the anatomical characteristics, the toe spread pattern, the mid-tarsal break, the pressure distribution, whose combination Cliff Barackman's track analysis career had established as the markers distinguishing genuine biological impressions from the fabricated and misidentification sources that the broader Bigfoot physical evidence record is contaminated with. The dimensional profile of the trackways placed them outside the size range of every known North American species. The distribution pattern across the investigation area indicated territorial use rather than transient passage, and the freshness of the most recent impressions, the edge sharpness and the moisture infiltration rate that Barackman's field assessment established, placed the most recent activity within hours of the team's arrival. Something had been in that location the same day the team arrived and was not far away when they got there. The acoustic evidence from the investigation's first night produced the second element of the concentrated profile. The call blasting sessions that Moneymaker directed produced responses whose character his accumulated years of acoustic field research had given him the framework to assess with the specific precision that distinguished genuine responses from the ambient sound events that investigators without his reference experience routinely misidentify. The responses were structured, they came from multiple independent directions, and their timing relative to the call blasting sequence indicated reactive rather than coincidental production. Something was responding to what the team was doing, and doing so with an awareness of the team's position in the landscape that the distance and the terrain between the response sources and the call blasting position made impressive rather than expected. What all of that evidence was building toward, what the concentrated physical and acoustic profile was establishing as the context for the investigation's most significant finding, is what Moneymaker's confirmation addresses in its most specific terms. Matt Moneymaker's confirmation of what Finding Bigfoot found during the buried investigation is the centerpiece of his public statement. The specific account of what the investigation documented that the prior 11 seasons of broadcast episodes were always building toward, and that the complete investigation record contains in a form the audience has never been shown. He does not frame the confirmation dramatically. His communication style has always been characterized by the practical directness of a researcher whose professional credibility rests on the accuracy of his assessments rather than the persuasiveness of his presentation. And the confirmation reflects that style in a way that makes it more significant rather than less, because the absence of dramatic amplification communicates that what he is confirming does not require amplification to establish its significance. What the investigation found during its second night investigation at the primary focal point of the location's activity zone is what Moneymaker confirms: a direct encounter between the investigation team and the subject of the research that the prior 11 seasons had been approaching without achieving. Not a thermal signature at a distance, not an acoustic response from the tree line. A direct encounter at proximity whose documentation the investigation's camera deployment captured in a form that the prior season's most significant findings had not produced. Multiple camera units covering overlapping fields of view at the primary focal point location. Clear atmospheric conditions whose visibility the camera's resolution was adequate to document what was present at the location in a form that distance and darkness had prevented in every prior investigation session across the show's run. And what was present at the location during the encounter, what the cameras documented in the overlapping coverage that the investigation's deployment had positioned to capture exactly this class of event, is what Moneymaker confirms the complete investigation record contains and what Animal Planet buried upon reviewing the footage. He describes what the cameras documented in terms whose specificity reflects his direct knowledge of the footage's contents. Not vague references to extraordinary evidence, but a description of the specific visual characteristics of what the cameras captured that establishes the character of the finding without claiming more than what the documentation supports. What the documentation supports is what the Finding Bigfoot audience has been waiting 11 seasons to see confirm. And what Moneymaker just confirmed is that the documentation exists, that it captures what the show was built to find, and that Animal Planet's burial of it is the reason the audience does not already know. Ranae Holland's response to what the Finding Bigfoot investigation documented during the buried investigation's encounter sequence is the element of Moneymaker's confirmation that carries the most specific evidential weight, because the significance of what she produced as a response is inseparable from what she is as a scientific observer and what the prior 11 seasons of the show established about the standard her responses represented. She was not a believer performing skepticism for the cameras. She was a working field biologist whose professional training had given her the framework to eliminate conventional explanations for anomalous biological evidence with the rigor that her academic background demanded, and whose on-camera application of that framework across 11 seasons of investigation had been consistently oriented toward the conventional explanation rather than toward the conclusion that the paranormal or the cryptozoological interpretation was warranted. The Ghost Adventures audience came to trust Zach Bagans because of his commitment. The Finding Bigfoot audience came to trust Ranae because of her skepticism. A finding that her skepticism could not account for conventionally carried a weight in the show's evidential record that no amount of Matt Moneymaker's enthusiasm or Bobo Faye's practical fieldcraft could produce. Moneymaker's confirmation addresses what Ranae's response to the encounter sequence was, and the description of that response is the most significant element of the confirmation for the audience that understands why her response is the standard against which the evidence quality must be measured. She did not produce the professional headshake that 11 seasons of prior investigation had established as her default response to evidence that her framework accommodated conventionally. She did not produce the qualified acknowledgement that marked the occasions when the evidence exceeded her conventional explanation capacity without fully meeting her positive confirmation standard. What she produced during the encounter sequence as documented in the investigation's complete footage record, is something that Moneymaker's confirmation characterizes in terms whose specific content communicates what her scientific framework produced when the evidence it was applied to exceeded its explanatory reach completely. He describes it as the response of a scientist who has spent a career applying a methodology to a question and has encountered for the first time an answer that the methodology did not produce, but that the evidence makes impossible to withhold. Whatever Ranae Holland said and did during the encounter sequence is in the complete footage record that Animal Planet buried. Moneymaker just confirmed it is there, and its presence in that record is the most significant thing about what the buried evidence contains. Matt Moneymaker's account of Animal Planet's decision to bury the investigation footage is the element of his confirmation that addresses the institutional dimension of what the Finding Bigfoot buried evidence represents, and his account of that decision is delivered with the specific quality of practical directness that his communication style applies to all of the significant things he says. He does not characterize Animal Planet's decision as malicious. He does not frame it as a conspiracy or as an institutional suppression in the sense that implies coordinated deception. He frames it as a calculation, a specific institutional calculation whose inputs were the footage's contents and whose output was the determination that those contents could not be broadcast within the format that Finding Bigfoot represented to Animal Planet as a commercial property. The calculation, as Moneymaker characterizes it, was not primarily about the evidence's authenticity. The network's review of the footage apparently produced no significant uncertainty about whether what the cameras had documented was real. The conditions of the documentation, the multi-camera coverage, and the investigative context within which the footage was produced were adequate to establish authenticity without the kind of ambiguity that might have given the network an editorial basis for treating the footage as suspect. The calculation was about what broadcasting the footage would mean for the show's format. Finding Bigfoot was a show organized around a search, a show whose commercial proposition, whose reason for the audience to return each season, was the sustained dramatic tension of a search that produced compelling approach evidence without definitive resolution. The footage from the buried investigation documented definitive resolution. It documented the answer to the question the show was built around, and broadcasting the answer, putting in front of the audience the footage that confirmed the search had succeeded, would have concluded the show's central premise in a way that the network determined was commercially incompatible with the franchise's continued production. Moneymaker's characterization of that calculation and of his response to it across the years between the burial and the confirmation is the most personally significant element of his disclosure. He built his life around the question the investigation answered. The answer was documented, and the institution that controlled the documentation decided the commercial value of keeping the question open exceeded the obligation to show the audience what the search had found. The complete investigation record from the Finding Bigfoot buried investigation, the footage, the instrument data, the biological sample documentation, and the team members' contemporaneous field documentation is in an archive whose custodial relationship Moneymaker's confirmation addresses without fully resolving the question of who currently controls it and under what conditions its contents might reach a public audience. What his confirmation establishes about the archive's contents is specific enough to characterize the nature of the buried evidence in a way that the prior public record of the investigation has not permitted. The footage component of the archive is the most immediately significant element, the multi-camera documentation of the encounter sequence, whose existence and whose character Moneymaker's confirmation has now established in the public record for the first time. His description of the footage's visual characteristics, what the cameras documented during the encounter sequence in terms of what was present at the investigation focal point, what its observable characteristics were, and how the documentation's quality compared to the prior season's most significant visual evidence, is the most detailed account of the buried footage's contents that has ever entered the public domain. The instrument data component of the archive documents the environmental monitoring readings from the encounter sequence, electromagnetic, acoustic, and thermal data, whose values Moneymaker characterizes in his confirmation as the most extreme the investigation's instrument deployment had ever produced at any investigation site across the show's run. The biological sample component is the element of the archive whose existence Moneymaker's confirmation reveals for the first time. Biological material recovered from the investigation focal point in the period following the encounter sequence under collection protocols whose rigor the team's preparation for the investigation had established in anticipation of exactly this eventuality. The material has been subjected to laboratory analysis whose results Moneymaker characterizes with the specific restraint that his scientific credibility demands, not as confirmation confirmation of a species identification, but as producing findings whose character places the biological material outside every known species in the regional biological record. The location of the archive, who controls it, under what legal framework, and what the conditions for its public release would require, is the element of Moneymaker's confirmation that the legal context of his public disclosure most constrains. What he is able to say about it is that the complete record exists, that its contents are what his confirmation describes, and that the question of its public availability is one whose resolution he is actively working toward. Matt Moneymaker spent decades building the infrastructure to find the answer to the Bigfoot question, 11 seasons documenting the approach to that answer in a format organized around keeping the answer at arm's length. His confirmation changes everything the show represents. The broadcast record is now established as the approach rather than the arrival. The arrival is in an archive. Its contents are what the confirmation describes. The complete investigation record, whose existence is now in the public domain, contains what Moneymaker built his life to find. The audience that followed 11 seasons of Finding Bigfoot now knows the search succeeded. The evidence exists. The answer is real. And what Animal Planet decided to do with the documentation of that answer is the reason the audience does not already know what he has spent decades pursuing. The confirmation is the beginning of the archive's journey toward the public. What it contains is what every prior season of Finding Bigfoot was pointing at, and Matt Moneymaker just made sure that pointing is now permanently on the record. The search is over. The answer exists. The audience deserves to see it.